Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the maybe younger millennials and Zoomers on the left, they're not swayed by the Gen Xers saying, "Hey, Dick Cheney supporting Kamala Harris." I mean, look who you're attracting, because they don't think that the neocons to them are not the worst kind of right. The MAGA right is much worse. And even though the MAGA is characterized by having a much more of a domestic orientation, domestic politics, not foreign policy. So it seems to me that with the younger left, foreign policy and to a certain degree, just kind of civil liberties, like of the Edward Snowden variety, right? The surveillance state and all that, it just doesn't hit with them. The term they use.
I,
It's unfortunate because they're maybe rightly in some cases that you can't tell someone what their priorities should be, but they're wholly fixated on the domestic culture war, and where that is concerned, someone like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, and they're not as offensive as a Tucker Carlson even. So it's like, and they're more afraid peripherally. They're more afraid of alt media now than mainstream media. So kind of Gen X and older fixation on mainstream media and maybe even the culture industry and manufacturing consent and themes like that, they're not really there anymore. They're totally fixated on white supremacy and transphobia. And so yeah, so the when I ask a question like what's AEI up to, and we say we don't shed a tear that their kind of reputation is faded or they receded into the mists, younger left doesn't really care. Younger libertarians, I don't know. But yeah, so
yeah,
it's the way the politics is changing here.
I mean, you're talking specifically about Gen Z left, and that sounds about right in terms of like where their focus are, where their focus
Even
is
though I'm
rather.
sorry, just want to interrupt real quick. Even though they're focused very much on Israel Palestine right now, it doesn't mean that
Right.
they have this kind of comprehensive anti-military industrial complex thing. To me, I think it's an extension of their own concern about domestic settler colonialism.
I agree with you there, but I mean, I might just push back a little bit. Maybe it's because of the space that I work in, but I've found younger people who are paying attention to the news and are paying attention to what's going on in Washington because that they grew up in the shadow of war, 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, the idea that we have always been in some sort of overseas intervention. And those overseas interventions have been translated pretty much by everyone now to be failures and based on lies, that Washington cannot be trusted to send men and women into war with any good reason. I feel that they come to the table with a great deal of skepticism, if not cynicism, about the military. And when I talk to these kids, they don't want to go to war. They don't trust what their leaders are telling them. They're not enlisting in the U.S. military. You see recruitment numbers are down pretty hard. And so I do think it does go a little deeper than just, and on both sides, left and right, it goes a little deeper than specific issues like Israel, Palestine, or Ukraine, Russia. I think that they just have a general disdain for the military as an institution, but they connect that back to the fact that we were in these failed wars and that the government can't be trusted to tell the truth. And so I do think that they are interested in foreign policy to the extent that they sense the corruption of the entire national security state, for example, and what it means. And maybe you're right. It's not like they're not going to the ballot box, with foreign policy in mind, but nor are most Americans, unfortunately. But yeah, I will agree with you. You say AEI and they're like, what? But if you say neocons, I think a lot of younger people know that word, and they know that if you scratch beneath the surface, they inherently believe those are the people who got us into those failed wars. And I wouldn't underestimate that the idea, or that they don't care or don't they're not bothered by the sort of Cheney neocon endorsement of Harris. I think that does bother people, but you have to make the argument. You have to tell them who they are, and I guess that's the problem. Like most people aren't going to inherently know those connections, but a lot of kids that are paying attention do know who they are, I believe. But that's just me, maybe in my little bubble.
It'd be interesting to consider the counterfactual if the U.S. had, say, cut off aid to Israel at the end of last year, and they're totally on their own, and Israel proceeded to act as if they've been acting this year. Would the young left be agitating for the U.S. to intervene, to do something about it, to stop the genocide? I kind of feel like they would be.
Yeah.
So but of course I can't prove that, and it's just it's a kind of pretty ridiculous counterfactual given how joined at the hip Israel and the U.S. are. But yeah, so let's talk about the figure who seems to be reaching the peak of his fame right now, John Mearsheimer. Now I know, Kevin, you're a huge fan, and I'm a pretty big fan as well. I've come upon some criticism of him. There's this idea that anti-Mearsheimer, or Mearsheimer as hawk, is sort of laying in waiting for the day when China becomes a big deal, because he's actually much more hawkish regard China.
Absolutely.
He just seems like a dove. You want to talk about that, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I respect him a lot, obviously, and particularly his stance on Israel. His stance on China maybe a little less, although it's a difficult question because the U.S. is the global hegemon right now, but we're obviously starting in decline. China's where we were, at the turn of the century, or maybe at the beginning of World War One, obviously on their way up, but they don't have the military side of it. They don't have a dominant navy yet, but they're working on it. And so, in the sense of, if you want to keep America powerful, Mearsheimer is correct in that we should be friends with Israel. We should friends with Russia, dump Israel, and concentrate on China. To me, I think maybe I have a defeatist attitude, maybe that, China, is going to be very difficult to stop China's rise. If we wanted to stop it, we should have done it 20 years ago. We should have never shipped all our factories over there. We shouldn't have immiserated our working class. Sorry to sound like a Marxist, but and we caused so much social upheaval within America that now neither the left or the right want to join the military anymore. The fighting force of America has traditionally been Appalachian country boys, and they are not joining anymore. They have had it. They, for whatever reason, maybe, for woke kind of things or whatever, they're just not joining anymore. And so, so Mearsheimer, he's a scholar. So I've read a lot of his work. It's very interesting. He's just following kind of the historic norm. If you were a statesman, you wanted to keep America powerful, and most statements that that's their job, then he's more or less correct. I was just writing about in World War II, Germany and Soviet Union. What Britain should have done is had those two fighting each other as much as possible. And so what we should be doing is having Russia and China fight each other. But we told the neocons, instead of accepting Russia as part of the West in 1990, they just had to keep pushing. They just couldn't accept it, and they embraced China too much. And so that was kind of, and you could say in hindsight, but I remember at the time thinking the same thing. It was obvious. You needed Paul Krugman and Thomas Friedman, constantly every week talking about the glories of globalization and how it's all going to be great. And to convince people, okay, we don't need these factories anymore. We'd send them to China.
The world is flat. Yeah.
Exactly. And it didn't work. And so, but yeah, Mearsheimer, you're absolutely right when it comes to China, and it is going to come to China at some point. It's going to be a little bit different. I can totally agree with him on Russia and Israel, and still be skeptical on China.
Yeah, I've watched a discussion recently. I forgot who it was exactly, but this guy and his guest, a Chinese woman in China, was pushing back on Mearsheimer's claim that China is expansionary in its, in the South China Sea, in the West Pacific, He said they've only been really expansive into Asia, not out into the ocean. So, if you're Tibetan, you're a Uyghur, you're Mongolian, maybe you're on the edges of the Russian state, that they've been more concerned about Russia's expansion, or excuse me, China's expansion, not the Philippines.
You have to understand the naval theory. There's these island chains: first island chain, second island chain, third island chain. China is like, it's like if some foreign power had the Caribbean, had Cuba and Jamaica, Puerto Rico. We were surrounded, and we couldn't get out in the Caribbean. They're surrounded. I mean, they're packed in, and so they want Taiwan to break the first island chain so that they become a blue water power. It's when you're an expanding economic power, that's kind of your right.
Yeah,
so
I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, apart from Taiwan, I think that Taiwan, but historically that's been pretty Chinese. But you can't say the same for Thailand and the Philippines and the Marshall Islands.
No,
they have been fighting with the Philippines over shipping lanes. Go ahead. I agree with you. Yeah, no, but they have been fighting over shipping lanes and trying to open up those spaces, like you said. I mean, they're a growing economic power. And they want to make sure that they can get, like, oversimplify what they got to sell to other parts of the world, and they're bigger and they are richer and they have more military power than their neighbors, and so they have been pushing out. The question, I think, is whether or not they want to, this idea that they want to push out even beyond the Asia Pacific and then start dominating other parts of the world and become a world hegemon. And I don't even think Mearsheimer believes that. I think what he's concerned about is that they will bully our allies. They will try to force the United States out and its influence out of the region. And we should be considering that as a serious threat. And I think he sees everything through international relations theory, and that's fine. That he is using history and a template to predict what China is going to do or what it's doing. I think there's an argument about how much of a threat that that China poses to the United States, and whether the United States needs to be on the forefront of some aggressive policy to keep China's power in check. And I think that's where the disagreements come, even within we consider John Mearsheimer a restrainer, and he's in that realist and restrainer camp, and he's actually one of our distinguished fellows at the Quincy Institute. But as he once wisely said, that sometimes circumstances call for realism, and sometimes it calls for restraint. And for him, the China conundrum calls for realism, and he believes that's the approach is to be to lead an anti-China sort of backstop or whatever hedge, or I don't know what the word would be for it, but not to just sort of be leaning into the restraint and doing less. And that's fine. I think it's a healthy conversation to have. What bothers me, and what I think is more of a threat to us, is you have these over-the-top hawks who are living in some Cold War reality where they want to keep pushing aggressively on the military front, and to the point where I think they would actually trigger a war. Like when Mike Pompeo goes out there and he said we should get rid of strategic ambiguity and just say out loud that we will militarily defend Taiwan if attacked by China. That ambiguity is what's kept the balance, there between us, China, and Taiwan. It would be a disaster. And so people like him, they're the dangerous ones. I think Mearsheimer, he's got theories and opinions, and I trust his judgment. But it's a debate. With these other hawks, it's not a debate. They actually want to go to war. I think they really want to go to war, or they want to get enough money. They want to get the money in their military-industrial complex slushing in preparation for the war, because if you dig a little deeper, they're somehow benefiting from it. So, whether it's the boards they're on or the contractors that they have ties to, that is the swamp. So it's all about what their motivations are too.
I see Mearsheimer as kind of a descendant of Keenan's containment strategy, whereas the neocons are like on the geopolitical offensive, like
George Kennan.
George Kennan, yeah. So he was on the geopolitical defensive, which is a stronger position actually. But so the neocons, and it started with James Burnham actually, who wrote The Managerial Revolution. He was a Trotskyite, and he was basically the first. He was basically a neocon, but after Second World War, he said America has to get out there and lead a permanent revolution against the communists and create a global republic, and kind of like a little bit what you see in the collective West kind of ideas right now. But where China could be good for the U.S. is as to force us to compete, to fix our problems, to get better, to bring back more manufacturing, to see it as a competition. But if we go straight to some kind of like Pompeo war, that's gonna be a disaster.
Yeah, we've kind of touched on economic.
China is not. Sorry, so we have this global hegemon. We had basically Britain and then the U.S. like a universal hegemon. China, even as a communist party, they're communism with Chinese characteristics. They don't see themselves as universal, that they're going to put a system down that the whole globe has to adopt. They want some kind of independence because they know the world's not Chinese. And so even with BRICS, you have these great civilizations that they work together, but they're independent, and not one dominates the other. So I think what China really, is important to them is access to South America, to the agricultural products, naval access to South America. But I don't see them, the problem is if they get so dominant technologically and they're on their way, then America has to keep up, or fall back, standard of living fall, and relative to China. So those are the choices, and to me the choice is to do the hard work and start competing.
Yeah, you and I differ a little bit on economic questions, and China could actually become wealthier than the U.S., but the U.S.
Absolutely.
can still become wealthier than it was. So things can improve for the U.S. even as its relative position worsens. So I mean, I'm not that fearful of China being at parity. Maybe if it's significantly beyond that, there are certain secondary effects or things to consider why that's not good. But I'm not as concerned about China rising in reaching parity with us, or maybe even
you're taking a more of a free trade approach, which is fine, but that's one approach. And so, but the thing is that once they reach parity, then what? They're going to keep going, and we're going to keep.
Oh, we can keep going back too. It's not zero sum, right? But yeah, it's interesting what you said about they don't have any pretense of having kind of a universal ideology, right? They're communism. Okay, it's roughly
Marxism is the most universal of ideologies, but they
right.
cap it. They call it with Chinese characteristics.
Chinese characteristics that's fixed
Limits
onto
it,
that statement takes it all back.
Yeah.
And
what's interesting though is that we do have this ideology which we won't acknowledge. So when we go out into the rest of the world and we offer our security assistance and development and aid, and it's part of this sort of universal ideal of democratization and liberalization, and it gets into imposing our values on other countries in exchange, like we will give them what we have, and they'll in exchange that they will agree to be part of this universal ideal of liberalism. And we're seeing some blowback from that now, while the Chinese are going and they're just giving money and loaning money and building bridges and infrastructure projects in the global South. And it's purely transactional. It has nothing to do with them spreading their ideology or having them sign on to any communist concepts. And so, I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying things a bit here, because there's troublesome aspects too with those relationships that they're building, and extracting resources and whatnot, and not having good labor practices, but etc. But the fact is that people are like tired of us telling people how to think and how to behave and what to believe in exchange for our help. And they're like, well, we can just get it from the Chinese and they just get off our backs, and I know I know this is a broad brush, but it's funny that we don't acknowledge that we have imposed an ideology on the rest of the world. It's just that because it's good in our minds, that sets it apart from other, other states that have, whether it be communism or fascism or what have you, that have tried to spread and grow power that way outside of their own nations.
Yeah, I wonder if, even if we didn't have a kind of universal liberal ideology, I mean, so I'm liberal, but I'm more of the kind of small man liberal or pluralist libertarian, something like that, where it's, you trust liberalism enough to not have it, or to not believe it must be kind of forced down people's throats, right? Maybe you can call it faith if you want, but if you're a liberal who does believe it needs to be shoved down people's throat, well, then that doesn't seem particularly liberal to me. And then I wonder what your convictions really are as far as the power of liberal ideas and whatnot. But even sans any kind of Wilsonian kind of idea about turning everyone into liberal, market-loving Democrats, wouldn't just America's own kind of ethnic pluralism and kind of domestic lobbies push for war in some cases? Here's just an example. So I'm partly Armenian, and the Armenian lobby influences the way we deal with Turkey, and they wanted to kind of highlight the Armenian genocide in a way Turkey did not want to. I don't remember all of these specifics around it. It's just kind of an ongoing thing, flares up now and then. So to what degree, I wonder, do just regular domestic politics and varied interests push people into war without any kind of overarching, just liberal imperative, of a kind of Rawlsian military type, right? How much could that get us into war? I think the support for Israel is one example of that. In fact, I think that's just purely domestic pressures, and not so much necessarily an inherently compelling Judeo-Christian liberal ideology, right?
I don't agree. I think what is more compelling to Americans is the post World War II mythology, that somehow we are the indispensable nation, that when we see trouble in another part of the world, when we see bad guys and evil surfacing, that we need to go out and slay it. And that we can do that because we're good and we're righteous and we're moral. And look what we did to Hitler. And then we rebuilt Europe. And I feel like that mythology is still very persistent. I think it's waning, and I think it's on the decline, because generation after generation have seen failure, whether it be Vietnam and then the 9/11 wars. And so that mythology is starting to get like withered and frayed, but it's still very persistent. And you see that with what's going on in Ukraine. So all of the tropes of World War II were exhumed and peddled and used endlessly to convince the American people that we had to put all of our energy into fueling the war in Ukraine, to expunge the evil of Russia. And my institute, the Quincy Insitute, took a lot of slings and arrows from the very beginning, because we looked at that and we said, okay, we look at the history of how this conflict happened. It's more complicated than good versus evil, bad guys, good guys, authoritarianism versus democracy. So we have that. And then we looked at the situation and says, well, at this point, we have to use diplomacy to end the war, because there is no way that Ukraine is going to win on the battlefield. It is not militarily going to happen. And so if we want to save this burgeoning quote unquote democracy from being absolutely demolished, we need to get both sides of the table, and NATO needs to stay out, because if this becomes a NATO versus Russia thing, this could be World War III. And that was the realist take. But because the mythology, the post-war mythology dictated that we had to treat this as though it was Hitler 2.0, we're still there. We're still fueling a war that every sound analyst of military history has said is not winnable on the battlefield. And we're seeing in real time what's happening in Ukraine. But because that narrative is so strong, and American people, who most of the time have one foot in and one foot out of foreign policy, just say, hey, we got to do this because this is what America does, and then they go on to domestic concerns. I don't think they're concerns by ethnic or other pressures. I think this is an American dream, and I feel like Vietnam should have shut that down forever, but it still lives on like a zombie.
I agree completely. I have so many friends who repeat the myth exactly as you say, that the world is evil and we're the good and we have to go out and fight it, from World War II. And I always have to point out that, it was really Stalin who defeated Hitler. It wasn't us. We got involved in June 44. I think the war started in 39. The U.S. defeated Japan, fair and square. But it was actually Stalin. So you're going to tell me, was Stalin good or evil? And that's where, and now it's ironic because now it's you have Ukrainians with German tanks, actually invading Russia.
It's so odd.
So all this kind of clear.
No one was talking about Ukraine as if it was some kind of bastion of freedom just before early 2022.
They were talking about the Nazis that were in the Azov battalion before, and Time magazine wrote about it, and the New York Times wrote about it. Everybody knew there were Nazis and white supremacists there, but then after it became this Manichaean conflict, we couldn't talk about that anymore until very recently.
Yeah,
I think the smartest thing the Democrats ever did was like linking Putin to the defeat of Hillary. They got like the kind of the good Democrats to like see Putin as just a projection of Trump, and we got to get our revenge. We can't get it on Trump, so we're going to get it on Putin. And I mean, as silly as it is, that drives people I talk to. I can still say this Putin's evil.
Yeah, it really is. It's dismaying how many people were for Ukraine war, U.S. proxy war, and only because they're fighting Russia. Russia is with Trump,
right?
Ergo, supporting Ukraine is anti-Trump. Yeah. It
was a complete conflation of domestic and foreign policy politics, and the Biden administration has absolutely fueled that. Like he said on the eve of the midterm elections, basically MAGA is for authoritarians, MAGA is against democracy, MAGA is pro-Putin. So it's just like this idea, like if and what bothers me about that is there are plenty of people who are not MAGA who have been critical of U.S. policy in Ukraine, but people with thinner skins would say, I don't want to be compared or conflated with MAGA, so I'm not gonna talk about Ukraine or my concerns about the policy because I don't want to be put in the same basket of deplorables, and I find it a smear too, where the Democrats have smeared critics of their policies by suggesting that they are pro-Putin, pro-authoritarian, isolationist, all of those little dog whistles that are two steps away, but from saying that you're pro-Hitler or you're a Nazi or you're a fascist. And I've been dealing with that for 2.5 years now. Luckily I work for an organization that we have a thick skin and we all stick up for each other. But the vitriol that we're getting from people on the left, on Twitter or X, people who supported Quincy because they thought, you're anti-war, you're anti-non-interventionism. Well, when they decided that the Ukraine war was the just war, then all of a sudden they didn't like Quincy anymore, and they're hurling all sorts of slurs at us, including the whole pro-Putin thing, because they didn't understand that we actually stuck to principles. Like, we are for restraint. We have an argument. It's not like we're just saying, oh, well, we can't get involved. We had a very cogent argument about why we needed to stick with restraint, even if we don't like Putin. And the same goes with Israel and any other conflict that comes up. But, you know, it's difficult to stick to principles, but also we're a transpartisan organization. So we don't feel the pressure of like going light because we like the guy in office or don't like the guy in office. You know, that doesn't dictate how we respond to these things either. So it puts us in a little weird spots.
I like that term, transpartisan, but you need that freedom as a thinker. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're just locked into a political candidate, you're just kind of writing their talking points. I don't know. I think to be a real thinker or critic, you have to be free of the partisan kind of sheep pens.
You really have to. And I mean, it's hard during election time, but I'll tell you, and when Biden won, before, during, and after, we had been pushing to get out of Afghanistan. That was one of our campaign goals, like get out of Afghanistan. We had a veteran who was kind of leading the charge. And guess what? We look behind us, and like a lot of these progressive groups that had been all about getting out of Afghanistan all the way up to the election were sort of like, yeah, you go ahead. You know, we got your back, but you go ahead. Because why? Because they were getting funding probably from Democratic donors, and you know, their guy wasn't settling in the White House, and they didn't want to go too hard on Biden. And I kind of laughed because I've been around for a while, so I kind of knew what was going on. But I think some of the younger people were like, wait a minute, what? I thought we were all against this war and getting our troops out of there, like, and they let us take the lead because they didn't want to be seen as criticizing the new administration. And so, like, and you'll see the same flip.
What about Code Pink? Is that one of those organizations as well? Oh, Code Pink?
I love Code Pink. They don't care. I mean, they love the fact that there are right and left that are fighting for peace and against these wars and restraint. And they don't care if it's a Democrat at the hearing table or a Republican. They will disrupt. They will protest. They call out the truth. I mean, some people say, oh, well, they're pretty radical or whatever. Well, you know what? We need people like that will disrupt a protest or disrupt a hearing or a speech, or be willing to be hauled out by security guards out of an event, because they're literally speaking truth to power. And I love them because they do show they will show up at when I was at the American Conservative, they were always at our events, and they were always saying, thank you for talking like this. Thank you for taking on the Washington blob. And that's why when Trita Parsi started the Quincy Institute, it was because he saw that there were forces on both sides that were willing to work together. And, you know, but, you know, obviously Washington is just like, it is an entrenched establishment of consensus thinking, but there are enough people agitating that if you brought them together, you know, you could possibly make a difference. And it's not easy, but I think he had the right mind, because there are people who are willing to work together, and they're usually the smartest people on the block too, because it's not politics that are animating them, it's actual thought.
That's true.
Okay, well, you know, we've been talking for about an hour here. I guess I'd wrap it up. If anyone wants to make any final points, go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm just thankful that you had me. We're airing all of these important issues.
Yeah, it's really cool to have you, Kelley. Yeah, take care, you guys. Thanks.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Bye.
I will.
Okay, take care.
Thanks. Bye.